I wasn't born into much, and I don't say that to earn sympathy. It's just the plain truth. My earliest memory is of a social worker buckling me into the back of a car with too many stuffed animals piled on the seat beside me, telling me we were going somewhere new. New became a revolving door. New foster homes, new bedrooms, new rules. By the time I turned 18, I had packed and unpacked more times than I could count. That kind of life teaches you two things fast. Don't get too comfortable, and don't expect permanence. By the fall of 1996, permanence wasn't even on my radar. I was 24, heart freshly cracked from a breakup, and carrying the dull ache of failure after losing yet another job in Sheffield. I had been working at a hotel as a maid. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the rent. When they let me go, I didn't argue. I just walked out the revolving glass doors and never looked back. My boyfriend left around the same time, said I was too restless, too uncertain. Maybe he wasn't wrong. I started scanning classifieds out of desperation. Buried between ads for farmhands and clerks was one that read, "Live-in housekeeper wanted for countryside estate. Room and board provided." The words stuck with me like a hook. A live-in position, a place to stay, a chance to start over. I dialed the number before I could second-guess myself. That's how I first spoke with Jonathan Hale. His voice was crisp, every word measured, like he rehearsed his sentences before letting them out. He said he lived in Northumberland, in a manor passed down through generations, and he needed someone who could cook, clean, and help restore order to the place. He asked only one personal question. "Are you dependable, Miss Morris?" I said yes. I needed him to believe it, even though my track record said otherwise. The train ride to Northumberland was long and gray, the kind of English countryside that looks romantic in postcards but lonely when you're staring at it through streaked glass. The cab driver who picked me up muttered about the Hale estate being a bit out of the way before driving me down narrow lanes bordered by towering pines. When the manor appeared, I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't a home. It was a monument. Tall stone walls, windows like dark eyes, chimneys rising like fists against the autumn sky. Jonathan met me at the door. He was in his late 40s, perhaps 50, neatly dressed in a dark suit even though it was just past noon. His hair was thinning, his jaw sharp, his eyes the palest blue I'd ever seen. He offered his hand, cool and dry, and welcomed me with a politeness that bordered on rigid formality. "Miss Morris," he said, as if the words were etched on a script. "I trust your journey was manageable?" "Yes, thank you," I replied, though the chill in my bones suggested otherwise. He showed me the house with the precision of a curator leading a museum tour. The ceilings were high, the rooms cavernous, each step echoing against wooden floors. He pointed out the library, the dining room, the upstairs hall, and finally a door at the end of the corridor. "This," he said softly, "is my wife's room. It remains locked. You'll have no cause to enter." He smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Out of respect." I nodded, though something about the way his hand lingered on the doorknob unsettled me. The rest of the tour was a blur of hallways, staircases, and instructions about silver polish and firewood. By evening, I was in my small attic room, unpacking the little I had. I lay on the narrow bed listening to the wind batter the windows, wondering what exactly I'd walked into. The first week passed with a strange sort of calm. My duties were straightforward: sweeping, dusting, cooking simple meals. Jonathan was courteous, almost overly so, thanking me for even the smallest task. He insisted I sit with him for tea in the afternoons, though the conversations were oddly one-sided. He asked about my work, but never my past. When I asked about his, he deflected with vague mentions of family obligations. It was on the third night that things began to shift. Jonathan instructed me to set 2 places at the dining table. I thought I misheard him. "For me and my wife," he said without hesitation. His eyes flicked to mine, sharp, daring me to question it. "I expect punctuality. Dinner at 7. I obeyed. though my stomach clenched. At 7, I served roast chicken and potatoes, pouring 2 glasses of red wine. Jonathan sat at the head of the table. Across from him, the second chair remained empty. He raised his glass, clinking it gently in the air. "To Margaret," he said softly, then drank. I lowered my gaze and excused myself. After dinner, he asked me to place the second plate outside the locked bedroom door. "She eats in her room these days," he explained, tone casual, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The next morning, the plate was untouched, cold, congealed. I carried it to the kitchen and tried to ignore the unease that prickled the back of my neck. The nights grew stranger. From my attic room, I sometimes heard murmurs rising through the floorboards. Jonathan's voice, low and intimate, punctuated by soft laughter. Once, I could have sworn I heard another voice, faint and female, whispering in reply. I told myself it was the wind, the pipes, the tricks of an old house. Still, I pulled the blanket tighter around me. One morning while dusting the study, I discovered a drawer in Jonathan's desk left unlocked. Inside was a neat stack of photographs. Each image showed a young woman in the same old-fashioned maid's uniform, standing stiffly, smiling nervously. I flipped through them, one after another. My chest tightened as I reached the last photo. It was me. The angle suggested it was taken while I was scrubbing the kitchen floor. I hadn't noticed anyone behind me. That evening, Jonathan presented me with a folded uniform. "It belonged to a previous maid," he said, voice gentle. "Margaret always liked the staff to look proper. I'd appreciate it if you wore this from now on." The fabric smelled faintly of old perfume, yellowed at the collar. My throat closed, but I forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Hale." When I slipped it on that night, the walls seemed to close in tighter, the manor colder, and Jonathan's gaze lingered longer, soft with something I didn't recognize, something that frightened me more than anger would have. By the second week, the manor no longer felt like a house. It felt like a stage, and I a reluctant actress. Jonathan hovered more often, watching as I swept, as I cooked, as I set the table for 2. He'd stand in the doorway, smiling faintly, murmuring, "Yes, just like that." When I looked up, he'd avert his eyes as though embarrassed. One evening, I summoned the courage to ask about Margaret. We were seated in the drawing room, the fire hissing low. "Your wife," I began carefully. Was she ill before she passed?" His head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Who told you she passed?" The question hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. My heart thudded. I just assumed. The locked room, the dinners? Jonathan leaned back slowly, his expression smoothing into something unreadable. "Margaret is very much with us," he said softly. "She's simply delicate. You'll understand in time." I nodded quickly, eager to retreat, though the chill in my bones wouldn't ease. That night, as I carried the untouched plate back from the locked door, I pressed my ear to the wood. Silence, then faintly the sound of breathing. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the tray. Sleep became impossible. Every creak in the hallway, every gust against the window made my nerves jolt. I began to wonder about the women in the photographs. Had they all left quietly? Or had they disappeared without a trace? One afternoon, while Jonathan was away in the village, I searched his room. My hands shook as I opened drawers, rifled through papers. On the nightstand was a framed photo. My stomach dropped. It wasn't Margaret, it was me, my face smiling as though I had posed willingly for him. I had never taken such a photo. The realization froze me. He didn't just see me as an employee. He saw me as someone else. His Margaret. And whatever that meant, it was dangerous. I began planning escape in whispers to myself at night. The manor was isolated, the nearest village miles away, and Jonathan kept the car keys in his pocket. My only chance was to leave while he slept. But the thought of moving through that dark house alone, with those endless hallways and the locked room beside me, left me paralyzed. Jonathan, meanwhile, grew more desperate. At dinner, his hand brushed mine as I set down the tray. His voice trembled. "Don't leave me again, Margaret, I couldn't bear it." His eyes glistened with tears, though his grip on my wrist was iron. "I won't," I whispered, forcing calm. "I promise." Only then did he release me. That night I packed my small bag in silence. Every sound seemed magnified, the zip of the fabric, the groan of the floorboards. I waited until the house was still, until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then I crept down the stairs. Halfway to the door, a voice stopped me cold. "Where are you going, Margaret?" Jonathan stood at the end of the hall, bathrobe hanging loose, eyes wide with terror or fury. I clutched my bag tighter. I need air. Just a walk." His smile returned, brittle. "No walks at night. Too dangerous. Come back upstairs." He extended a hand. My legs trembled, but I obeyed. For now, the wrong move could end badly. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Jonathan's behavior escalated. His hands lingered on my shoulders, his voice cracked with pleading. "Don't make me lose you again." He followed me into the kitchen, into the study, hovering like a shadow I couldn't shake. I decided it was now or never. When he finally fell asleep in his chair by the fire, I stole the keys from his pocket. My hands shook so violently I thought they'd wake him. Somehow they didn't. I crept through the hall, past the locked door, heart pounding. For one terrible second, I thought I heard movement inside the room. A whisper, fingers brushing wood. I didn't look back. The car started on the second try, headlights slicing through the darkness. Gravel sprayed under the tires as I tore down the lane, not daring to breathe until the manor was swallowed by trees. In the village, I stumbled into the small police station, wild-eyed and shaking. I told them everything. Jonathan's obsession, the photographs, the dinners for his dead wife. They listened, skeptical at first, until I showed them the stolen photo from his nightstand. My own face, framed as though I were his possession. The police investigated. Jonathan was taken away quietly, muttering about Margaret, insisting she had come back to him. The locked bedroom was empty. Only dust, old clothes, and the faint scent of perfume lingered. There had never been a living woman behind that door. Just his grief, festering into madness. I left Northumberland the next day. I didn't look back. But even now, years later, I sometimes wake in the night with the sensation of someone's breath at the back of my neck, and I remember his words, "Don't leave me again." Grief can twist into obsession when left unchecked, turning memory into delusion and affection into control. I'd always been the one my family relied on. At 24, I balanced 3 part-time jobs just to cover my younger brother's mounting medical bills. Mom had passed years ago, and Dad worked long hours as a mechanic, barely able to keep us afloat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was survival, and survival was my full-time job. Every night I'd come home exhausted, my feet aching, my hands raw from scrubbing floors and folding laundry for others, but I never complained. Someone had to keep the household going. That September, a flyer tacked to a utility pole caught my eye while walking home from the diner. Live-in cleaning position, remote estate, room and board included. I stared at the words like a lifeline, my heart pounding with a mix of hope and caution. The pay wasn't great, but I didn't need great. I needed a roof over my head and enough to keep Daniel's treatments on schedule. By the time I reached Raven Ridge, fog rolled across the streets like a low-hanging blanket. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, with shuttered stores and cracked sidewalks. My cab wound up a narrow, winding road, and there it was, the Blackwell estate. The mansion was enormous, Victorian with dark stone walls and gables that jutted into the sky like jagged teeth. Windows reflected the gray sky, some cracked, some boarded. I swallowed hard and gripped my suitcase tighter. Mr. Blackwell greeted me at the door. He was tall, thin, with hair combed back so precisely it looked sculpted. His eyes were dark and unblinking, and they weighed on me like judgment itself. "Welcome," he said, voice calm but cold. "You'll have your own room. I have one rule. Never enter the second-floor bedroom at the end of the hall." He paused, the words hanging like smoke. "It's private." I nodded politely, forcing a smile, though my curiosity pricked like a needle in my chest. "Of course," I said. The first few days were ordinary. I polished silver, scrubbed floors until my hands burned, and prepared meals while the house groaned under its own weight. Every evening I paused outside the locked bedroom. Sometimes I swore I heard dragging sounds, heavy and deliberate, like furniture being moved. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses do that, I reasoned. But deep down, unease settled into my bones. Then the storm came. Lightning split the sky while I carried a basket of laundry up the narrow staircase. The hall smelled of wet wood and ozone. That's when I noticed it. The door to the forbidden room was slightly ajar. My chest tightened. I froze, one hand on the doorknob, one on the basket. I peeked inside. The room was dim, lit only by the lightning flashes. On a chair lay a maid's uniform, perfectly pressed, but streaked with something dark. Blood. My stomach churned, and then I saw the hand. Pale, lifeless, curling from beneath the bed like a claw reaching for me. I stumbled back, the basket tumbling to the floor, laundry spilling like a waterfall. My breath caught in my throat. Panic surged. I turned, running down the hall, my feet slipping on the wet wood. At the bottom, Mr. Blackwell was waiting. Knife in hand, his calm voice cut through the storm. "You weren't supposed to see her, now you know too much." I bolted through the back door into the rain, heart hammering. The truck on the road slowed, and I leapt inside, gasping. I didn't stop until the estate vanished in the fog behind me. After that night, sleep became a stranger. Every shadow in my apartment seemed alive, every creak in the floorboards a threat. I avoided mirrors. I avoided silence. I avoided thinking about Ravenridge, though the image of that pale hand under the bed haunted my dreams relentlessly. I found a temporary job in town while I tried to sort out what had happened, but something about the estate gnawed at me. Part of me wanted to believe it was imagination, a trick of exhaustion and fear. Another part knew the truth. Mr. Blackwell was dangerous, and the house wasn't just empty walls, it had a presence, something that waited and watched. A week later, I returned, not to confront him, but because I couldn't resist knowing. Driving past the estate, I slowed my car. The mansion loomed in the fog, silent, waiting. I noticed movement behind a second-story window, a shadow passing quickly. My stomach sank. I drove away before curiosity could turn into foolishness. In the days that followed, I began noticing things at my new job, small, subtle reminders of what had happened. Tools missing, items misplaced, whispers in empty rooms. It was as if the fear I'd left behind had followed me. I told myself I was imagining it, but the dread didn't leave. Then came the letters. Handwritten, unsigned, slipped under my door. One read simply, "You saw too much." Another, "It's not over." My pulse would spike, hands trembling as I read the words, the penmanship eerily precise, almost clinical. I reported it to the local police, but without evidence, there was nothing they could do. Months passed. I tried to reclaim normalcy. I returned to school, enrolled in night classes, and focused on helping Daniel with his treatments. The letters stopped for a while. I believed it was over. I was careful, always aware of my surroundings, but I refused to let fear rule me. Then I got a call from an estate agent. Someone had bought the Blackwell estate. The new owner wanted to renovate. Curiosity surged, and against my better judgment, I visited. The house was gutted, empty, almost sterile. There was no sign of Mr. Blackwell, no trace of blood, no sign of the maid's uniform. It was as if the nightmare had been a dream. But I knew better. I knew the truth didn't need proof. Danger had a way of leaving nothing behind. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Years passed. I moved cities, found steady work, and built a small life of routine and stability. Yet every stormy night, I remembered the cold eyes of Mr. Blackwell, the dragging sounds in the hall, the pale hand beneath the bed. I learned to trust my instincts, to act quickly when fear whispered warnings, and to never ignore what felt wrong. When Daniel finally graduated from his treatment program, healthy and strong, I allowed myself a sense of relief. But the lessons of Raven Ridge lingered. Life could turn on a dime. Fear wasn't something to be ashamed of. It was a signal, a guide. The final reminder came unexpectedly. I received a package in the mail, no return address. Inside was a single pressed maid's uniform. I didn't open it. I left it on the curb, watched the garbage truck take it away. And in that moment, I realized the final truth. The fear I carried wasn't just about Mr. Blackwell or the estate. It was about learning to listen to myself, to act with courage, to survive. I never went back to Raven Ridge. I never tried to confront him. I didn't need to. What mattered was knowing I could face fear and live. Life is unpredictable, dangerous at times, and often unfair. But resilience isn't about avoiding fear. It's about facing it and moving forward anyway. Fear is a signal, not a prison. Life will test you in unexpected ways, but courage is learning to trust yourself, act decisively, and survive, even when the odds seem impossible. True strength isn't about ignoring danger. It's about acknowledging it and refusing to be controlled by it. I grew up knowing life rarely cut anyone a break. At 16, I already felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. My mom, Laura, worked late hours cleaning office buildings in Ashford, a city that never seemed to sleep. Between school, homework, and my part-time cleaning shifts alongside her, I barely had time for friends. College seemed like a far-off dream, a luxury I might never afford without going into debt. Every dollar I saved, every hour I worked, felt like a lifeline. Not just for me, but for our family. The streets of Ashford were slick that October night in 2003. A fine drizzle coated everything, reflecting the glow of the street lamps. Mom and I had just finished the last of our afternoon jobs at a small grocery warehouse. "I don't want you staying too late tonight," she said, frowning. "These office buildings, they can be unpredictable, you know that." I nodded, brushing damp hair from my face, though my mind was already focused on the job ahead. The big office complex downtown was different from anywhere I'd worked before. Towering over the city like a silent sentinel, its steel and glass walls gleamed in the night. Most of the lights were off, but the occasional flicker of a hallway bulb suggested the building still had life, or ghosts. When we arrived around 10 p.m., the security guard, a middle-aged man named Mr. Klein, handed us the keys and warned us to stay near the main floor. I nodded again, gripping my cleaning supplies tightly. My mom moved with practiced efficiency, wiping surfaces and emptying trash cans, while I followed, vacuum in hand. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the hum of machines and the squeak of wheels across polished floors. By 3 a.m., we were nearly finished with the 15th floor, the topmost level. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you second-guess every sound. I was vacuuming near the end of a long hallway when I froze. Faint, almost imperceptible, I thought I heard a voice. A whisper. "Help me. Please." My pulse accelerated and I glanced down the hall. Shadows stretched and flickered under the dim lights. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining it. But then it came again. Softer, desperate, terrified. I grabbed the walkie-talkie, my hands shaking. "Mom, did you hear that?" Silence. My chest tightened. Something wasn't right. My curiosity and fear battled for control. Against better judgment, I tiptoed toward the sound, vacuum dragging behind me. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, each step echoing. Shadows twisted in ways that didn't make sense. I rounded the corner and saw a door slightly ajar. Beyond it, a man crouched over a young woman, his grip firm around a small knife. Her eyes were wide with panic, tears streaming down her cheeks. My stomach lurched, but I forced myself to breathe. "Hey, stop!" I yelled, voice shaking despite my attempt at authority. "The police and security are on their way." The man froze as if startled into reality. The woman gasped, terrified, but alive. Then, realizing he'd been caught, he bolted, disappearing into the darkness. I rushed to the young woman, her hands trembling violently. "It's okay," I whispered, gripping her shoulder. "You're safe now. I called for help. Police are coming." By the time authorities arrived, Mom had called a full emergency, and paramedics took the woman away. Later, the man was captured after a citywide manhunt. He never admitted to the crime, but justice caught up with him. The nights following that incident were some of the hardest I've ever endured. I couldn't sleep. Every flicker of light, every creak in the floorboards felt like a threat. Every office building I passed on my way to school or work reminded me of that night. The long hallways, the echo of footsteps, the way shadows could hide danger. Mom noticed the change in me. She didn't push me to talk at first, just let me sit quietly at the kitchen table while she sipped coffee. One night, I finally spoke. "Mom, what if I hadn't gone toward the voice?" I whispered, voice trembling. She placed her hand on mine, warm and grounding. "Then someone else might have had to step up," she said softly. "But you did. You were brave. That counts for something." I didn't feel brave. I felt scared, hollowed out by the memory of the man's eyes and the woman's screams. I struggled through the next few weeks at work, keeping a careful watch for anything unusual. Every shadow made my heart race. Every unlocked door made my stomach knot. Despite my fear, I refused to quit. I couldn't. There was a sense of responsibility that had taken root inside me that night. A knowledge that sometimes courage isn't about strength, but about stepping into fear and acting anyway. I continued helping my mom clean offices and warehouses, but with a newfound awareness, a sharper vigilance that became instinct. At school, I buried myself in studies, determined to create a future where fear wouldn't define me. Every evening after finishing shifts, I would sit at the small kitchen table, head bent over textbooks, my hand hovering over a calculator, counting every dollar I could save for college. The memories of that night were never far away, but slowly I began to channel the fear into focus. By the time I turned 18, I'd saved enough to attend college without going into crippling debt. I chose social work and safety planning as my field, determined to help others navigate dangerous situations. The lessons of Ashford haunted me, but they also guided me. I learned to trust instincts, to recognize warning signs, and to act decisively when lives were at stake. Even after moving into a dorm room and meeting new friends, I carried the weight of that night. Late-night walks across campus reminded me of dim hallways, flickering lights, and the sharp, cold fear that had driven me to act. But I also remember the surge of courage that followed, the realization that stepping forward, even when terrified, could save someone's life. Occasionally, I would run into news stories about assaults in office buildings or urban areas. My heart still clenched, but instead of panic, I felt determination. I began volunteering at local shelters and training programs, teaching awareness and self-defense. I wanted others to know that fear could be a guide, not a prison. Years passed, and I graduated with honors. I found work in community outreach, helping survivors of violence and teaching safety workshops to young adults and teens. Every session I led carried a bit of my own story. The late-night warehouse, the flickering lights, the moment I had to decide whether to act or run. I never stopped thinking about that woman in the office building. I never knew her name or if she recovered fully. But every time I faced a challenge, I remembered her face, the fear in her eyes, and the small but profound truth. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing action in spite of it. Now, at 28, I sometimes walk past empty office towers at night, the city's neon glow reflecting off wet streets. Memories of that October night never vanish completely, but they've transformed into lessons. I've learned that fear is a compass, warning us when danger is near, but also pointing us toward courage if we're willing to follow it. I think back to my mom, to the countless hours spent scrubbing floors, and I realize she taught me more than cleanliness and responsibility. She taught me the value of persistence, of showing up even when life feels unfair, and of protecting what matters. The flickering lights, the desperate whisper, the shadowed hallway, all of it shaped me into someone who refuses to be paralyzed by fear. Sometimes life puts us in moments where instinct and courage collide. It's terrifying. But if we trust ourselves, act decisively, and remember why we're standing there in the first place, we survive. And sometimes we save others too. Fear is not weakness. It is a guide, a warning, and an opportunity to rise. Courage doesn't mean absence of fear. It means acting despite it. Life will always test us, but true strength lies in acknowledging fear, trusting your instincts, and stepping forward anyway. I used to tell myself I wasn't afraid of starting over. After all, my whole adult life had been a long string of restarts. New jobs, new flats, new cities, always chasing stability that never seemed to last. But deep down, I knew better. Every move chipped away at me, made me feel smaller, less rooted, less certain that I'd ever find a place where I belonged. By the summer of 1992, I was 30 years old, raising my daughter Sophie on my own in a cramped flat in Edinburgh. The wallpaper peeled, the heat barely worked, and the neighbors never looked you in the eye. I'd tried to make it feel like home for her, but even a child can sense when a place doesn't want you. Sophie was 5, clever and sweet, always asking questions that I didn't have the heart, or sometimes the knowledge, to answer. Her father was long gone. He left bruises, both on my skin and in the way I looked at men afterward. He didn't leave money, though. That was always on me. I worked as a cleaner in offices, hotels, wherever I could get shifts, but the pay was miserable and the hours unpredictable. More nights than I care to admit, I went to bed hungry just to make sure Sophie had a proper meal. When a former coworker mentioned a live-in maid position in Cork, Ireland, I hesitated at first. Moving countries felt impossible, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the only way out. Housing included, steady pay, no rent worries. I could save for Sophie's schooling. Maybe, just maybe, I could finally stop running. I left Sophie with my sister for the summer, promising I'd send for her once I was settled. The ferry ride to Ireland was gray and windy, and I remember gripping the railing, staring at the waves and trying to convince myself I was strong enough for whatever came next. The mansion itself sat on the outskirts of Cork, a sprawling coastal estate that looked like something from an old novel. The stone walls rose high and unwelcoming, the windows narrow and dark even in daylight. When I walked up the gravel drive with my single battered suitcase, the air smelled of salt and damp earth. My stomach knotted as if I'd already made a mistake. Thomas Wainwright, the owner, greeted me at the door. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered but not young. His hair was more gray than black, and though his voice was kind, his eyes slid past me, never quite meeting mine. He shook my hand with surprising gentleness. "Welcome, Evelyn. I trust your journey wasn't too dreadful." "It was long," I admitted, "but I'm glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity." "You'll find the work manageable," he said. "This house has more rooms than I know what to do with, but it doesn't demand as much care as you'd think. You'll have a small room on the second floor. Comfortable enough, I hope." The corridors were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their painted eyes following me as I walked. The ceilings stretched high, swallowing light, and the air carried a permanent chill, as if the sea had seeped into the walls. Even so, I forced myself to smile, to act grateful. I told myself this was my chance to rebuild. That first night, After unpacking in my narrow room with its iron bed and lace curtains, I lay awake listening to the house breathe. The floorboards creaked even when no one walked. The wind rattled loose panes, and then faintly, I heard it. A soft sound, like someone crying far away. I sat up, straining my ears. The sobbing floated down from the upper floors, rising and falling, steady as a heartbeat. The next morning, I asked Thomas about it over tea. He didn't flinch. "Old houses have their secrets," he said lightly. "Ignore them, Evelyn. They mean nothing." But the way his eyes drifted, never quite resting on me, told me he didn't believe his own words. By the second week, I had fallen into a routine. Up early to prepare breakfast, dusting and polishing through the morning, laundry and linens in the afternoon. The mansion was vast, but many rooms stood unused, their doors locked or simply gathering dust. I kept mostly to the hallways, the dining room, the library, and the bedrooms Thomas directed me to maintain. He himself was polite, unfailingly so, but distant. He rarely spoke at length, and when he did, his tone was clipped, rehearsed, as though he were reading lines from a play. He never asked about Sophie, never asked about me at all. The house unsettled me more with each passing day. Windows seemed to catch less sunlight than they should, leaving even the brightest mornings gray. The mirrors were worse. Every time I cleaned one, I had the eerie sense that the reflection wasn't quite right, that a shadow lingered just behind me, that my own face looked fractionally altered. Once, while polishing the long mirror in the main hallway, I saw movement. A woman stood behind me in the reflection, her maid's uniform neat, but stained dark at the collar. Her throat was slashed wide, her eyes empty. I dropped the cloth with a gasp, spinning around. The hallway was empty. Only the faint scent of old perfume clung to the air, sharp and powdery, not mine. I wanted to dismiss it as exhaustion, but the sobbing at night continued, sometimes joined by footsteps pacing just overhead. I would lie stiff under my blankets, telling myself it was the wind, or pipes, or rats. But deep down, I knew those were lies. Houses don't weep. Houses don't pace. One evening, I found the courage to ask Thomas again. We were in the dining room, the silver catching candlelight as I set the table. He sipped his wine and said, without looking at me, "The past never really leaves a place like this. But it cannot harm you, Evelyn, unless you let it. Best to show respect in silence." His words chilled me more than comforted me. I wanted to press him, but the weight of his gaze, or rather the lack of it, the way his eyes lingered over my shoulder instead of meeting mine, made my throat close. I nodded, finished my task, and retreated to my room. That night, the crying was louder. I sat on the edge of the bed, trembling, until the sound faded into silence. For the first time, I considered leaving, but the thought of returning to Edinburgh broke me. Sophie needed me to endure. I had to stay. It was in the attic that I learned the truth, or enough of it to unravel the fragile calm I'd built. I hadn't intended to go there. The key turned up in a drawer while I was dusting the study, a small brass thing that seemed too deliberate to be misplaced. Something in me insisted I try it. The attic door at the end of the narrow servant's staircase resisted at first, then swung open with a groan. The air inside was stale, thick with dust. Shafts of light cut through cracks in the roof, illuminating rows of boxes, old furniture draped in sheets. But what caught me were the uniforms. Dozens of maid dresses, neatly folded, stacked on a long trunk. Some were pristine. Others bore stains along the collars and sleeves, dark and stiff with age. My stomach churned. I reached out, touched one, and snatched my hand back as though burned. On top of the stack lay a photograph. It showed a woman in uniform, her smile forced, her eyes wary. I didn't recognize her, but something about her expression felt painfully familiar, as if I'd looked that way myself in the mirror more than once, hopeful, but bracing for disappointment. My hands shook as I set the photograph down. The sobbing started again, only this time it was close. Too close. I turned, scanning the shadowed corners, heart pounding. No one was there, yet the sound filled the attic, soft and broken, like someone crying into their hands. I fled, slamming the door behind me, clutching the brass key as though it might protect me. That night I dreamed of uniforms lined up like soldiers, of faceless women with slashed throats reaching out their hands to me. The next evening, when I tried to leave, the doors refused to open. I checked the windows too, but the latches were jammed tight. My chest tightened. The house wasn't just old, it was keeping me in. Panic rose, sharp and choking. I raced through the corridors, testing every exit, finding each one stubbornly closed. My breath came fast, ragged. I was trapped. The sobbing returned, louder now, insistent, echoing through the hallways. I pressed my palms to my ears, but it was inside me, vibrating in my bones. I stumbled into the hallway mirror, catching sight of myself, or what I thought was myself. The reflection showed me standing, but my eyes were hollow pits, my skin ashen. And then that version of me jerked backward, dragged into the shadows by unseen hands. I screamed, shattering the silence. Evelyn. His voice came from behind me, calm, steady. I spun. Thomas stood there, expression unreadable. You're not here to leave. You're here because you remind me of her, just like the others. The house knows who stays. I shook my head violently. What are you talking about? Open the doors. Let me go. His gaze slid past me again, to something I couldn't see. You've already been chosen. Struggling will only make it worse. I backed away, my hands trembling, the sobbing rising around us until it drowned out thought. I wanted to fight, to scream, but the house pressed down, suffocating, inevitable. The following days bled together, if they were days at all. Time felt different in the mansion, stretched and twisted. I slept in fits, waking to whispers outside my door. The crying never stopped. Sometimes it sounded like Sophie, and that broke me more than anything. I would run through the halls, calling her name, only to find shadows and silence waiting. The uniforms haunted me, their dark stains, the photograph of the smiling maid whose fate I could now guess. I understood then that the house fed on us, our labor, our hope, our despair. We came here seeking refuge, and we became part of its history instead. One night, exhausted and near delirium, I confronted Thomas in the library. He sat in a leather chair staring at the fireplace, though no fire burned. Why me? I demanded, my voice raw. Why any of us? He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes. His were empty, bottomless. Because you were willing. Because you came seeking safety. And because this place requires devotion. It always has. I wanted to strike him, to scream, but the strength left me. I sank to my knees, tears spilling. Somewhere deep in the house, a door slammed shut. I knew it wasn't the wind. It was the sound of another life ending, another woman folded into the silence. The mirrors became cruel after that, showing me futures I didn't want to see. Myself in uniform, blank-faced, serving tea. Myself wandering the halls long after death, sobbing for release. I stopped looking, but I couldn't stop feeling the weight of the house pressing me down, rewriting me. I don't know how long I've been here. The days blur, the sea forever pounding against the cliffs beyond the windows. Sometimes I still dream of Sophie, of her small hand in mine. Sometimes I hear her crying in the halls, and I run, but she's never there. I think she's safer without me. Better to grow up with the truth that her mother disappeared than to see what I've become. The house has me now, and like the others, I know I will never leave. Sometimes the greatest prisons are not the ones built with walls and locks, but the ones we step into believing they will save us. Desperation can make us accept cages disguised as refuge, and cycles of abuse repeat when we silence our instincts. True freedom begins not in running from fear, but in refusing to surrender ourselves to it. I've always been drawn to caring for others, Maybe it was because my own childhood was fractured, filled with moments I preferred to forget. By the time I turned 23, I had spent most of my adult life taking care of children, tutoring, babysitting, doing whatever I could to earn a living while paying off student loans. The work was hard, low-paying, and often thankless, but it gave me purpose. So when I received the offer to become a live-in nanny and housekeeper for the Harrison family in Windermere Heights, I hesitated. The estate was massive, perched on a hill overlooking the river, shrouded in mist even on sunny mornings. The salary was more than generous, enough to wipe out the lingering debt that hung over me like a storm cloud. Still, something about the family's secrecy made me pause. They didn't speak much in the interview, and the estate felt old, like it had absorbed decades of unspoken histories. I arrived in early autumn of 2001. The leaves were turning shades of amber and rust, and the air was heavy with the damp smell of the river. The house itself was overwhelming, a sprawling structure of dark stone, tall windows, and endless hallways. The Harrisons greeted me politely, almost formally. Mr. Harrison barely looked up from the newspaper, murmuring a curt, "We trust you entirely," while Mrs. Harrison's eyes lingered on me longer, her expression unreadable. I was shown to my room, a modest space tucked near the nursery, and instructed on my duties. Most of my days would revolve around the children's quarters, keeping them clean, organized, and safe. At first, the work was mundane, even comforting in its routine. But the very first night, I noticed the cradle rocking gently, though I remembered locking it myself. I shook it off as an old house settling. Then came the laughter. Faint, almost childlike, echoing in the halls when no one else was around. I told myself it was imagination, but a cold knot formed in my stomach every time I heard it. By the end of the first week, I realized that something about the estate wasn't ordinary. I began noticing subtle patterns. The nursery felt alive in ways that didn't make sense. Blankets would be slightly moved, toys shifted, and the rocking of the cradle always followed a rhythm. I kept a notebook, documenting everything, the times, the movements, even the faint whispers I sometimes heard when alone. One evening, while scrubbing the nursery floor, I froze. The blankets on the crib were slightly tugged, as if a tiny hand had moved them. My eyes scanned the room, and then they landed on a photograph of a baby girl in a silver frame. The eyes, bright, inquisitive, and achingly familiar, stirred a memory I couldn't place. A shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't explain why, but I felt as though the child in the photo had been watching me all along. Later that evening, Mrs. Harrison finally spoke. She had been silent for weeks, appearing only to give instructions or check on the nursery from afar. "Keep the nursery clean at all times," she said, her voice cold, but almost pleading. "She will return. Someday." I blinked. "Return? I don't understand." Mrs. Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "She passed years ago, but the house is waiting for her." I wanted to ask more, but she didn't. The statement lingered in my mind like fog. That night I awoke to a cold tug at my wrist. Tiny fingers gripped my arm, gently pulling me toward the nursery. My heart pounded as the realization struck me. I hadn't been hired to care for living children. I had been hired to care for a ghost. The following weeks were a delicate balance between routine and vigilance. I cooked, cleaned, and tended to invisible hands and faint giggles that seemed to drift from room to room. I learned to move slowly, speaking softly when I sensed a presence, and always watching for patterns. There was a rhythm to the house, almost as if it were alive. Sometimes the Harrisons appeared in the hall, silent and observing. Mr. Harrison would stand by the doorway, hands clasped, expression unreadable. Mrs. Harrison would glance at me fleetingly before disappearing. I began to accept the oddity, documenting everything in meticulous detail, keeping a journal and snapping photographs of the nursery. I also learned to respect the boundaries of the house. Doors I had once explored now remained closed. Hallways I had wandered down were off limits unless summoned. I began to notice a strange comfort in routine, a sense that by honoring the house's rhythms, I was creating stability for whatever or whoever resided within. As the weeks turned into months, I started to understand the strange presence, the rocking cradle, the soft giggles, even the cold tug at my wrist. It was all communication. The child wasn't malevolent. She was trapped, longing for recognition, for someone to care. I found myself talking aloud sometimes, narrating my actions as I cleaned. "I'll fold your blankets now. Your toys will be tidy." I didn't know if she heard me or if it mattered, but it felt right. At night, I would sit by the crib and hum softly, noticing the rocking slow as I sang. There was a fragile peace in the ritual. Yet, even as I grew accustomed to the presence, I never felt entirely safe. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, and the air would grow icy in a heartbeat. The Harrisons never intervened, never explained further. I began to realize that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. They are meant to be honored. Eventually, my time at Windermere Heights came to an end. I left with mixed emotions, relief, exhaustion, and an unexpected sense of loss. I felt as though I had abandoned someone who wasn't alive but would never truly leave me. Years later, I still dream of the nursery. I dream of tiny fingers tugging at my wrist, of the baby girl's eyes from the photograph staring through the shadows. I never share the full story with anyone. I know they wouldn't understand. But I carry the lessons with me: patience, vigilance, empathy, and respect for what we cannot fully see. The house continues to wait, patiently, for the next caretaker. And I know that whatever presence resides there has left a mark on me I will never shake. Not all care is for the living. True empathy requires patience, attentiveness, and the courage to honor the unseen. Life and even the unknown demands respect, vigilance, and understanding. Sometimes the most important work is caring for what cannot care for itself, and listening to the quiet, persistent signs that guide us. When I was younger, I believed that survival meant clinging to someone else. I grew up in a working-class family in Puebla, Mexico, and like most women of my generation, I married young. I thought marriage would provide security, but instead, it became a slow erosion of who I was. My ex-husband was ambitious, successful in business, but cruel in the ways that are hardest to prove. Dismissive words, a wandering eye, money held over me like a leash. By the time I was 52, he had left me for someone younger, and I was left with little more than a small car, a few boxes of belongings, and a body tired from decades of bending to other people's demands. The divorce hollowed me. I had poured myself into a family that vanished in a signature on paper. Friends grew scarce, either too uncomfortable to choose sides, or too polite to ask about the settlement they knew had left me nearly broke. Nights were the worst. Silence pressed against me until I thought I might suffocate. I prayed often, not for riches or romance, but for some kind of steady ground where I could plant my feet again. That's when I saw the ad. A family in Ciudad del Sol, a wealthy enclave on the edges of Mexico City, needed a live-in maid. They offered stable pay, room and board, and the promise of safety within their high walls. I hesitated at first. Ciudad del Sol was glamorous, but also notorious. Rumors of kidnappings, cartel activity, and extortion circled like vultures over its manicured streets. Still, I had no real choice. I needed the money. I needed to feel useful again. When I arrived at the Montrose estate in January of 1995, I felt small and exposed. The mansion rose from behind 12-foot walls topped with barbed wire, a fortress of glass and marble. At the gate, armed guards inspected my bag before waving me through. Inside, Mrs. Montrose greeted me with a cool efficiency. She was elegant, slender, and distant, though not unkind. Her husband shook my hand firmly, introducing himself as Eduardo. Their young son, Mateo, peeked out from behind his mother's skirt, shy but curious. The house bustled with staff, gardeners, cooks, a chauffeur, and other maids. I was shown my room, modest but clean, tucked away near the back of the house. The air smelled faintly of polish and citrus, every surface gleaming as though the house itself demanded constant worship. The security guards moved in pairs, patrolling the grounds. Their radios crackled day and night, a constant reminder of danger pressing against the walls. For the first few weeks, I buried myself in routine. I swept, dusted, and scrubbed until my hands ached. I ironed crisp linens and polished silverware until I could see my face in the spoons. Every day at noon, I prepared snacks for Mateo, who slowly grew comfortable enough to sit with me in the kitchen and chatter about his school lessons. He liked to draw, handing me pictures of dragons and superheroes. I saved every one, tucking them into my Bible at night. Though I tried to ignore it, whispers of violence seeped in. Neighbors spoke of gunshots heard in the distance, of cars speeding away under cover of night. The guards were strict, reminding us to never linger outside the walls and to lock every door even during the day. Yet inside, life carried on with a strange, forced normalcy. The Montroses hosted small gatherings, clinking glasses while music floated through the halls. I often wondered if wealth made danger feel less real, or if it only built prettier cages around it. For the first time since my divorce, I felt the faint stirrings of stability. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something close to breathing freely again. I had no way of knowing how quickly that illusion would shatter. It happened on a Thursday evening in March, a night that began like any other. I had left the estate in my small car to run an errand at a nearby market. On the way back, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died near the edge of the highway. I cursed under my breath, smacking the steering wheel. The car was old, temperamental, and I knew I should have had it serviced weeks earlier. I waited nearly an hour for a tow, the sky bruising with dusk as traffic roared past. By the time the car limped back to the estate, darkness had settled thickly over the neighborhood. I expected to see the familiar glow of lights spilling from the mansion windows, the sound of guards calling to one another at the gate. Instead, the estate was silent. The gates were half open, the guards missing from their posts. A sharp unease settled in my stomach. I parked crookedly near the entrance and hurried toward the house, my shoes crunching on the gravel. Inside, the air was heavy, too still. I called out softly, "Senora? Eduardo? Mateo?" But my voice echoed without reply. I moved through the grand foyer, the polished floor reflecting my distorted reflection. That was when I smelled it. Acrid, metallic, faintly like fireworks after they've burned out. Gunpowder. My legs felt weak, but some force pushed me forward. The door to the master bedroom, usually closed and guarded, stood slightly ajar. My hand trembled as I pushed it open. The sight inside cleaved my world in two. The Montroses lay sprawled across the bed, their bodies riddled with bullets. Mateo's small form was curled near his mother, still, impossibly still. Blood pooled on the white sheets, dark and glistening. Casings littered the floor like cruel confetti. Furniture was overturned, curtains torn. The smell of death, coppery and final, hung so thick I gagged. I staggered backward, clutching the doorframe. My scream tore from me, raw and animal, but no one came. The guards were gone. The house, usually teeming with life, was silent as a tomb. I ran. My shoes slipped on the marble, my lungs burning as I burst out into the night. The street beyond was empty, shadows stretching long under the street lamps. I waved frantically at the first passing car, a beat-up sedan. The driver slowed, his eyes wide at the sight of me. "Call the police, please, hurry!" I cried, my voice cracking. He nodded quickly, fumbling for his phone. I sank to the curb, shaking so violently I thought my bones would splinter. The acrid stench clung to my nostrils, the images of their bodies seared into my vision. I prayed to wake up, to discover this was some grotesque dream. But the sirens that wailed closer only confirmed the nightmare was real. The police swarmed the estate within minutes, their flashing lights bathing the walls in red and blue. Officers moved through the house with measured steps, their radios crackling. They asked me questions, but my answers stumbled out in broken pieces. All I could say was that I had arrived late, that the guards were missing, that everyone inside was already dead. The scene was chaos. Neighbors gathered at the gates, whispering in horror. Some crossed themselves, murmuring prayers. Others pulled out cameras, recording the tragedy as though it were a spectacle. The police cordoned off the area, pushing back the crowd. For hours I sat on the curb, wrapped in a thin blanket someone had given me, trembling while officers filed in and out. Eventually, one detective knelt beside me, his eyes dark and weary. "Senora, we need you to think carefully. Did you see anyone leave the property? Any cars speeding away?" I shook my head, my voice hoarse. "No, no one. Only the open gate." His lips pressed into a hard line. "The guards are missing. Likely complicit. This was planned." The word cartel was whispered among the officers, though never directly to me. Everyone in Ciudad del Sol knew the reputation: extortion, kidnappings, executions. Families like the Montroses lived under constant threat, their wealth a target. Yet no group claimed responsibility. No ransom note, no message scrawled on the walls, just silence and bodies. I was questioned until dawn. When they finally released me, I returned to my small rented room miles away, though I barely recognized it anymore. The sheets smelled different, the air too thin. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mateo's still form, his crayons scattered on the nightstand. I sobbed until my throat ached. Survival felt less like luck and more like a cruel accident. If my car hadn't broken down, I would have been inside the house when it happened. For weeks, I barely slept. I jumped at every sound, convinced men with guns would burst through my door. People avoided me, afraid that speaking to me might invite danger. When neighbors asked about the estate, I only shook my head. Words were useless against images carved so deeply into me. Time did not heal. It only hardened. Months passed, but the investigation led nowhere. The guards were never found. No arrests were made. The Montroses' relatives buried their dead with little ceremony, preferring silence to risk. The mansion stood empty, its windows dark, its walls scarred. People whispered that the house was cursed, that blood had seeped too deeply into the marble. I tried to return to work, but every house felt unsafe. Every unfamiliar sound tightened my chest. I left Mexico City within a year, drifting from job to job in smaller towns, always looking over my shoulder. I stopped making friends. I stopped trusting silence. At night, I would wake drenched in sweat, the acrid stench of gunpowder filling my lungs again. The worst part wasn't the fear. It was the guilt. My lateness had saved me. I told myself that truth again and again, but it never brought comfort. It brought shame. Why them and not me? Why Mateo's drawings folded in my Bible and not Mateo himself still drawing? Survivors talk about blessings, about second chances. I felt only a void, as though fate had chosen me at random and left me carrying a burden too heavy for my shoulders. Years passed. I aged into lines and gray hair, carrying the memory like a stone in my chest. I built a life of sorts. Small jobs, small apartments, never staying long. I avoided parties, celebrations. Anything that demanded laughter I no longer had. People thought I was bitter, but I wasn't. I was haunted. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see the Montroses' bedroom as if I'm standing there again. The smell, the silence, the sharp glint of casings across the floor. Some nights I dream of arriving earlier, of throwing myself in front of the bullets, of Mateo's small hand gripping mine as we run. I wake gasping, tears on my cheeks. I learned to live with shadows. I learned that safety is an illusion, that walls and guards mean nothing against those determined to destroy. What stays with me is the fragility of ordinary moments, the laughter of a child, the clink of glasses, the hum of daily chores. They can vanish in a heartbeat, replaced by silence so heavy it never leaves you. Life's fragility is not measured by wealth, walls, or guards. True safety lies not in fortresses, but in cherishing the fleeting, ordinary moments we often take for granted. Violence reminds us how precious life is and how quickly it can be taken. Survivors do not carry blessings alone, they carry responsibility to remember, to value, and to live fully in honor of those who cannot. When I left Wales, I told myself I was leaving behind every ghost that ever clung to me. My childhood had been a carousel of temporary rooms and temporary parents. Foster homes where I was told to be grateful, to smile, to keep my head down. I learned early how to polish silverware until it reflected someone else's face, not my own. I learned how to pack fast, because staying too long meant someone would decide I didn't belong anymore. That rhythm followed me into adulthood. Short jobs, small apartments, never rooted, never still. By the time I turned 27, I'd worked in hotels, private homes, and even a retirement facility, always as a housekeeper. Cleaning wasn't my dream. I used to sketch dresses when I was younger, imagining myself as a designer. But survival came first. Survival meant finding work where someone needed me, where I could be useful. My last post ended abruptly when the family decided they wanted staff with more polish. I packed again, rode the train again, and stared at the want ads until my eyes blurred. That was when I saw the notice about a live-in maid needed in Portland, Maine. A chance for a steady roof, steady pay, a fresh start. I bought a one-way ticket before I had the courage to hesitate. The Leonard house was nothing like the old manors of my childhood foster placements. This wasn't creaky wood and faded wallpaper. It was glass and stone, all sharp angles and reflective surfaces, sitting on the outskirts of the city like something pulled out of a magazine. When I walked up the long drive that November afternoon, rain slicking the pavement, I felt swallowed by the sheer size of it. The windows loomed high, cold, like eyes that didn't blink. Mr. Leonard opened the door himself. He was tall, carefully groomed, his dark hair threaded with silver. His handshake was firm, his smile polite but controlled. "Mara Whitfield, yes? Thank you for coming." He ushered me inside with the air of someone who had already memorized my movements. Mrs. Leonard appeared only briefly in the hall, pale, gliding past in a silk robe without a word. She didn't acknowledge me, only drifted toward the staircase as though I weren't there at all. The house was immaculate, the kind of immaculate that felt less like cleanliness and more like obsession. No speck of dust, no smudge on the glass. My room was tucked in the back, small compared to the cavernous rest of the house, but I told myself it was fine. I'd had less before. The view overlooked the woods, branches swaying in the gray rain. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the trees were pressing closer. Mr. Leonard gave me my instructions that evening, standing in the kitchen with his hands folded behind his back. "Your duties are straightforward," he said. "Dust daily, floors polished, meals prepared at precise times. The upstairs rooms are not to be entered unless I tell you. And..." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Ignore the noises at night, Mara. Just keep to your duties. Everything else is unnecessary." I nodded, though the words lodged like stones in my chest. Ignore the noises. I wanted to ask what he meant, but his expression suggested no answer would come. I unpacked my single suitcase in silence that night, smoothing out the same 2 uniforms I'd worn for years. When the lights flickered once, briefly, I told myself it was the storm. Still, I lay awake long after midnight listening. The house groaned like an animal breathing. My first week at the Leonard's house unfolded with a kind of strange repetition. Dust, polish, sweep. Prepare meals that Mrs. Leonard barely touched. She drifted like smoke, moving soundlessly from one room to another, never speaking more than a murmur, and never to me. Mr. Leonard was different. He was present, always, watching from doorways, standing too close when he inspected the table settings. His eyes scanning like he was measuring me against something. The house unsettled me. Doors that should have opened easily were sometimes locked tight. A hallway light flickered every evening at nearly the same time, no matter the weather. At night, I'd hear whispers in the walls, soft, rhythmic, almost like the recitation of a prayer. Once I pressed my ear to the plaster and thought I heard my own name. When I asked Mr. Leonard about it over breakfast, his knife paused mid-slice through toast. "I told you, Mara. Ignore the noises. They mean nothing." His smile was polite, but his tone was final. I dropped the subject. One rainy afternoon, while tidying the living room, I noticed the couch pushed slightly askew. I bent to straighten it and saw a corner of leather poking out beneath the frame. I pulled it free. A small locked journal, worn from age, with scratches across its cover. It was heavier than it looked, as though whatever lived inside it carried weight. I tried the clasp, locked. My pulse quickened. I told myself to put it back, but instead I slid it into my apron pocket. For the rest of the day it pressed against my side like a secret heartbeat. That night I couldn't stop staring at it. I turned it over in my hands, the scratches catching the lamplight. My fingers itched with curiosity. At midnight, I found a small set of tools in the laundry room. The lock snapped with a soft click, almost too easy. My stomach flipped as I opened it. The first entry was dated the same day. November 10th, 2015, my first day in the Leonard house. I scanned the page, and my blood ran cold. Every task I had done that day was written in neat script. She dusted the shelves. She polished the glass table. She stared too long at the locked upstairs door. I dropped the book, my breath shallow. It was impossible. I hadn't written those words. No one had been beside me, and yet the journal had recorded it all before I even remembered it. I forced myself to turn more pages. Each one documented the days I'd been here. She chopped vegetables clumsily. She hummed while cleaning the floor. She hesitated before knocking on the master bedroom door. My chest tightened. They weren't just records. They were observations, predictions. The last page I turned to chilled me most of all. It was blank except for tomorrow's date, waiting. I slammed it shut and shoved it under my pillow. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the words again. She. Who was writing this story of me? And why did it already know what I hadn't yet done? The next day I went through my routine in a daze, terrified of every movement. Was I performing my life, or was my life being written for me? Each time I reached for a rag, each time I turned a doorknob, I wondered if it had already been written on a page somewhere. The journal sat hidden in my room, though it felt like it burned through the walls, demanding to be opened again. That evening, after dinner, I gave in. My hands shook as I flipped to the entry marked with that day's date. My blood chilled. It described me finding the journal, unlocking it, and reading the words with terror in my eyes. I slammed it closed again, breath ragged. It wasn't recording my life. It was dictating it. I was still clutching the journal when the kitchen light flickered. I turned, heart pounding. Mr. Leonard stood in the doorway, silent, his gaze fixed on the book in my hands. He didn't speak at first. The silence stretched until my throat ached. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice low and deliberate. "Do you even remember who you are, Mara?" The words rooted me to the floor. "What do you mean?" My voice trembled. "I don't understand." He tilted his head, watching me like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. "You think you were hired? You think you're the maid?" His lips curved into something like pity. "But you were never hired. This job, it's a memory. You are not who you believe." I clutched the journal tighter. "That's insane. I know who I am." He shook his head slowly. "Do you? Then why does the book know your every move? Why does it know what you'll do before you do it? Because it isn't your story, Mara. It never was." I backed toward the door, shaking my head. "You're lying. This is some kind of game." He didn't follow, just stood there, his eyes unblinking. "Look at the last page," he whispered. "See for yourself." I wanted to throw the journal into the fire to let the flames eat every word, but I couldn't. It sat on my lap as I turned to the final entry. The date was today. The words were short, sharp, and final. She will discover the truth. She is not the maid. My hands trembled so hard the journal slipped from my grip. It landed on the floor with a heavy thud. My heart hammered in my ears. Not the maid. What did that mean? I thought of the locked doors, the whispers, the way Mrs. Leonard drifted past me without acknowledgement. I thought of how Mr. Leonard watched me, not with suspicion, but with certainty. Certainty that I wasn't what I thought I was. That night, the house shifted. The shadows seemed to stretch longer. The reflections in the glass distorted just slightly, like my face didn't quite belong to me. When I spoke aloud, my own words echoed back a second later in a whisper, not my own. I pressed my palms to my ears, but the whispers slipped through anyway. Mrs. Leonard appeared in the hall once, her eyes hollow. She stopped in front of me, tilting her head. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, she reached out and touched the sleeve of my uniform. Her hand was cold, almost lifeless. Then she drifted away again, leaving me shaking. I tried to leave. I grabbed my bag, stormed to the front door and pulled at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Locked, bolted from somewhere beyond my reach. Every door I tried was the same. Even the windows, heavy glass panels, wouldn't open. It was as if the house had sealed itself shut. The walls hummed with a low vibration, alive with something I couldn't name. The whispers grew louder. She is not the maid, she is not the maid. By dawn, I was curled on the floor of my room, the journal clutched against my chest. I knew, with sick certainty, that I wasn't living a life. I was replaying one, an old script, a reenactment, a prison. The days after blurred, time became slippery. I'd wake in the morning to find my bed made, though I didn't remember doing it. I'd enter the kitchen and see a meal half prepared, though I hadn't touched the stove. The journal filled itself, pages turning with each action, mocking me. Sometimes it wrote faster than I could move, finishing sentences before I spoke them. Mr. Leonard no longer gave instructions. He only watched, calm, patient, like someone waiting for me to accept what he already knew. "You see now," he said one evening, his voice soft as silk. "This house doesn't keep you. You keep the house. You are not here as staff. You are part of its memory." I wanted to scream, to fight, but even my anger felt written. When I tried to shout, the words caught in my throat, and what came out was nothing more than a whisper, echoing back at me from the walls. The house wasn't just holding me. It was erasing me, replacing me with the role it wanted, the maid who had always been there, who always would be. One night I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. It wasn't me. The woman staring back wore the same uniform, but her face was thinner, older, her eyes hollow. She lifted her hand when I did, but a fraction too slow. I stumbled back, clutching the wall. The whispers surrounded me. She is not the maid. By the end of November, I no longer counted the days. The journal did that for me. I turned its pages once more, though I knew what I'd find. Blank lines stretched forward, waiting. I realized with horror that they weren't telling my future. They were waiting for me to keep living the script, to fill them in with every step I took. I wasn't free. I was a character, endlessly repeating. The Leonards moved like shadows around me, and I understood at last. They weren't my employers. They were players in the same cruel performance, and I was the center. Not Mara Whitfield, not a maid from Wales, but the story itself. A story that had no ending. When we lose hold of our identity, when we let others define our role, we risk becoming prisoners in someone else's story. Freedom begins with remembering who we are, not who others insist we must be. When I first came to Greystone, I told myself it would be temporary. Just a year or two in this city, long enough to finish my psychology degree, save up some money, and move on. But temporary has a way of stretching into permanence, especially when you don't have much left tying you anywhere else. My mom had passed away 3 years earlier, a slow battle with cancer that hollowed her out and left me with more grief than answers. I never knew my dad, no siblings either. I'd grown up surrounded by people but somehow ended up alone, carrying my life in boxes that fit into whatever apartment I could barely afford. Greystone was an odd place, neither bustling like New York nor sleepy like the small towns I'd lived in before. Its streets twisted and turned, cobblestones mixing with patches of modern asphalt, old brick buildings looming beside sleek glass offices. It had history, but it also had a kind of emptiness, the kind of city where you could vanish and no one would ask where you went. I supported myself with odd jobs. Babysitting, waitressing, cleaning apartments. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. One evening, while scrolling through classified ads at the university library, I came across a listing for a part-time cleaning position. One apartment, high floor, consistent schedule, good pay. It sounded too good to pass up. I dialed the number, and a calm male voice answered. His name was Victor Langford, a corporate lawyer. He said he needed someone trustworthy, discreet, and consistent. I told him I was all three, even though I didn't quite believe it myself. The first time I went to his building, I felt small. 12 stories of glass and steel, polished to a shine, towering over the narrow street. The doorman gave me a curious glance when I asked for Mr. Langford, but he waved me through. The elevator ride was smooth and silent, each floor chiming with a muted ding until I reached the top. When the doors slid open, the hallway was empty, carpet plush under my shoes, a single door waiting at the end. Victor himself was exactly as I imagined. Tall, thin, sharply dressed, his hair slicked back in a style that looked outdated but deliberate. His smile was polite but tight, like he'd practiced it. His handshake was firm, his eyes quick but strangely evasive. He guided me inside with precise movements, speaking in clipped phrases. "The rules are simple," he said. "Clean the kitchen first, then the living room, then the bedrooms. Dust every surface, vacuum nightly. Check all locks before you leave. Do not, under any circumstances, open the small study at the back of the apartment. Understood?" I nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good." He paused, studying me as if measuring whether I would obey. Discretion is everything. The apartment was beautiful but unnervingly silent. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, but the curtains were always drawn halfway, muting the view. The furniture was modern, angular, everything placed with mathematical precision. No photographs, no clutter. It felt more like a showroom than a home. The work was easy at first, polishing, dusting, restocking supplies. I told myself it was the best job I'd ever had. Good pay, quiet hours, no drama. But even in those first few days, something in the air unsettled me. The silence seemed too heavy, too absolute, as if the walls were holding their breath. The first odd thing happened during my second week. I had finished vacuuming the living room and locked the door behind me, just as Victor asked. When I returned the next morning, the chairs were slightly rearranged, the throw pillows flipped upside down, the rug misaligned. At first I thought maybe he'd been in there overnight. But when I asked him casually, he shook his head. "I don't use that room," he said flatly. "That's your responsibility." "Then maybe the cleaner who comes before me." "There is no one before you," he cut me off. His tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. "You are the only one with access. Remember that." I nodded, uneasy. I reset the room exactly as it had been and tried to push the thought away. A few days later, he started calling at odd hours, sometimes midnight, sometimes later. His voice on the phone was urgent but measured. "Nina, check the study. Make sure it's locked. Turn the lights off." The first time I told him I never went near that room. He simply repeated, "Check it. Now." Then the line went dead. I started to dread the calls. Each one chipped at my nerves, leaving me tense and shaky. I wanted to ask why he was so obsessed with the study, but something in his voice told me not to. One night, as I was wiping down the kitchen counters, The apartment phone rang. I sighed, expecting Victor's usual order. But when I lifted the receiver, what I heard froze me in place. A voice, soft and trembling, whispered, "Help me. Please." My grip tightened. "Who is this?" No answer. Just breathing. And then I realized. The voice sounded exactly like mine. My own voice, pleading from the other end of the line. I dropped the receiver like it burned me. The dial tone buzzed in the silence, mocking me. After that, the apartment changed. The mirrors reflected me at odd angles, sometimes showing me in rooms I hadn't entered. Shadows fell wrong, stretching longer than they should. At night, I heard faint footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. The air grew heavier, pressing on my chest until I could barely breathe. Victor noticed nothing, or pretended not to. He began pacing for hours, muttering under his breath, watching me with eyes that seemed to see past me. Sometimes I caught him standing in the doorway, silent, his gaze fixed not on me, but on the empty space just behind me. The storm came on a Thursday night. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rattled the glass. I was finishing the living room when the phone rang again. Victor's voice was sharp this time, almost frantic. "There's an intruder. The study. Go now. Lock it. Hurry." Against every instinct, I obeyed. The hallway to the study felt longer than usual, stretching into shadows. The door was heavy, the brass knob cold under my hand. I turned it, half expecting resistance, but it swung open easily. The room was bare except for a wall of mirrors. They faced each other, multiplying endless reflections into infinity. But none of them showed me. Instead, each mirror reflected Victor's face, twisted in fear, rage, anguish. His expressions shifted from one pain to another, a kaleidoscope of torment. My stomach lurched. "Victor," I whispered. But the voices came instead. My voice. Dozens of versions of me echoing from the mirrors, all begging, all screaming, all whispering at once. "Help me. Please let me out. Don't leave me here." I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The room tilted, reality bending. And then the truth hit me like a blow. I wasn't me. I wasn't Nina at all. I was just a fragment, a personality Victor had constructed in his fractured mind. Every chore, every instruction, every phone call, it was all part of his system, his way of rehearsing control. I was the maid, the caretaker, the silent companion he invented to keep himself company. The study wasn't forbidden because it hid secrets. It was forbidden because it was the core of his mind, the place where his masks collided. The mirrors weren't showing me. They were showing him. After that night, nothing felt real. I kept moving through the motions, dusting, vacuuming, checking locks, but every step was mechanical. The walls seemed to pulse, the mirrors to breathe. My reflection no longer matched my movements. I would raise a hand and she would hesitate, lagging behind like a puppet unsure of its strings. Victor grew worse. His pacing turned to frantic circles, his muttering to outright arguments with no one in the room. Sometimes he shouted my name, but I wasn't sure if he meant me or the version of himself that had given me form. I started to wonder if I was a dream he'd projected so strongly that I believed I was real. The thought hollowed me out. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. His voice was hoarse. "They don't listen anymore," he said. "The voices. They used to stay where I put them, but now they wander. You wander." "Victor," I said softly, "I don't understand." He looked up, eyes bloodshot, wild. "You're not supposed to understand. You're supposed to clean, keep order, keep me safe. But you ask questions now. You're wrong." Fear coiled in my gut. I wanted to run, but where would I go? Could I even leave if I wasn't real? That night I dreamed of the study again. The mirrors stretched wider, swallowing me whole. My voice echoed, splitting into 1,000 versions. I woke up screaming, but the sound didn't come from me. It came from the apartment itself. The end came quietly. No thunder, no drama, just silence. I arrived one evening to find the apartment empty. No Victor pacing, no muttering, no instructions. His suit jacket hung on the back of a chair, his shoes neatly lined at the door. But he was gone. I waited hours listening to the ticking of the clock, expecting him to burst in at any moment. He never did. The next morning, the neighbors whispered that he had vanished. No trace, no farewell, just gone. Police searched, psychiatrists speculated, but nothing concrete surfaced. They found his notes, though. Dozens of journals filled with detailed accounts of his split identities, names, schedules, chores. My name appeared over and over. Nina, the caretaker, the loyal one. I read those words and felt my heart crumble. I was never more than ink on a page, a voice in his mind, a projection in his mirrors. My existence ended with his, yet I remained trapped, lingering in the corners of the apartment like an echo. Every night I dust the shelves. I vacuum the rug. I check the locks. And I wait for his call, knowing it will never come. I am Nina. I am not Nina. I am both the maid and the master, a fragment of a man who tried to control his chaos and became lost in it. And now I exist only in repetition, a ghost without a body, endlessly rehearsing the madness that created me. When we bury pain instead of facing it, when we build walls of silence in order to contain the chaos inside us, those walls become cages. Victor's desperate attempt to control his fractured mind gave life to illusions, but it cost him his own reality. The lesson is simple but vital. Healing begins not with denial or control, but with truth, vulnerability, and seeking help before the mind becomes its own prison. I never imagined I'd be running across the Atlantic for a cleaning job. But there I was, 26, orphaned, and scraping together whatever work I could find to survive. Bristol had been hard enough. Foster homes, odd jobs, and the persistent sense that stability was a myth. When the agency called about Willowcrest Manor in Salem, Massachusetts, I jumped at the chance. It promised room and board, decent pay, and the chance to finally live somewhere I could call temporary home. Temporary, that word had always been my lifeline. The manor itself looked like something from a storybook written by someone with a taste for gloom. Gray stone walls towered above me, framed by wrought iron gates, ivy creeping up like veins across the facade. The air was damp, salty, carrying a faint scent of old wood and cold stone. The drive up was long, lined with twisted oaks whose branches looked like arthritic fingers. I arrived just as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting everything in a grayish gold light. Edward Thornton greeted me at the front door. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and polite to the point of being unnerving. His smile was precise, rehearsed almost, and when he shook my hand, I felt a strange chill crawl down my spine. "Welcome to Willowcrest," he said softly. "I trust you had a pleasant journey?" I nodded. "Yes, thank you, sir. It's beautiful." "It has its history," he replied, eyes flicking past me to the looming front hall. "I'm certain you'll take good care of it." From the first steps inside, I sensed the manor had its own rhythm. Floorboards creaked in predictable ways, but sometimes I thought I heard them groan where no footfall existed. The air was thick, as though each room had absorbed decades of whispered conversations, laughter, and grief. Edward led me through the main hall, past the dining room, the library, and several bedrooms whose doors remained ominously locked. "You will care for the house," he explained, "the grounds, and the private quarters occasionally. There's a rhythm to every day. Learn it, follow it, and you'll be fine." I nodded again, but the unease was growing. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses have quirks, I told myself. Loose floorboards, cold drafts, shadows that move in the corner of your eye. Rational explanations kept my thoughts tethered to sanity, at least for a while. That night, I lay in my assigned room, small but tidy, with windows facing the eastern gardens. The manor felt alive in a way I couldn't describe. I thought I heard soft footsteps pacing the upper floors, or was it just my imagination? I tried to sleep, but the house had a heartbeat of its own. Somewhere far away, a door creaked open, then closed. I whispered to myself, "It's just the wind," and eventually drifted into uneasy sleep. The first week passed with uneventful routine. I polished furniture, dusted high shelves, and maintained the rooms Edward had instructed me to focus on. Each evening, he asked me to leave a small plate of food outside a specific locked room on the second floor. "For my late wife," he said simply. I assumed it was a ritual of remembrance, a lonely gesture of devotion. But it didn't feel right. The smell of perfume lingered in the hallway, though no one else seemed to walk there. Sometimes when I glanced at the mirrors, I thought I saw movement behind me, shadows that didn't belong to me. One evening, as I polished the grand staircase, I swore I heard whispering from the locked room. Words indistinct, soft, almost teasing. I froze, listening. The whispering stopped the instant I moved toward the door. "Vivian!" Edward's voice startled me from behind. He had appeared silently, hands folded. "The rooms have their own life. Some things are better left untouched." "Yes, sir," I said, my voice quieter than intended. I tried to push the unease aside, focusing on chores. But the house was patient. It waited, and the shadows always returned. One night I stayed up late cleaning the dining room when I heard sobs drifting from the second floor. I paused, breath caught, and for the first time I wondered if I was imagining things. I took the stairs slowly, hand gripping the railing, and reached the hallway outside the locked room. Silence. Just silence. The sobbing vanished. I began to dread my reflection. Mirrors multiplied my anxiety, showing me in the hallways I hadn't yet walked. It was as if the house itself was rearranging reality around me. Then came the study. While dusting the library, I found a small hidden door at the back. Edward had never mentioned it. Curiosity overtook caution. I opened it, revealing a chest filled with Maid uniforms. Some were pristine, others torn, collars darkened with what I didn't want to imagine. Photographs rested atop the folded garments, each one depicting a maid wearing the uniform as Edward expected. I froze when I saw the last photograph. It was me, or rather, it could have been me. The resemblance was uncanny. My stomach turned cold. A scent of perfume hit my nose, strong and familiar. Panic crept up my spine. I should have closed the chest and run, but I couldn't. Something deeper than fear rooted me there. Edward appeared in the doorway, his calm presence almost cruel in contrast to my rising panic. "Please, don't leave," he said softly, handing me a yellowed uniform. "She loved it when the staff dressed properly. She would have been so pleased to see you tonight." My hands shook as I took the uniform. Everything clicked into place. The locked rooms, the plates of food, the whispers. He didn't see me as Vivian Clark. He saw her, his late wife, the woman who had left this world but had not left his mind. I was a placeholder, a living memory, trapped in his obsession. After that night, I walked the halls like a ghost, performing every duty while Edward observed. Each movement, each polish of a surface, felt rehearsed, mechanical. Sleep became impossible. Shadows lengthened unnaturally. The perfume followed me even into empty rooms, and every mirror reflected not me, but the woman he mourned. The locked room became a beacon of terror. Sometimes I thought I heard laughter, other times cries that pierced my chest. Edward's voice would float down the hallway. "Remember, she loved this. She would have wanted it." I nodded without understanding, feeling smaller with each passing day. One evening I decided I couldn't endure it anymore. I packed a small bag and crept toward the front door, heart hammering. But the manor seemed to resist me. The door felt heavier than it had before. I thought I heard Edward's voice from every corner echoing my name softly. "Vivian, don't leave." I ran anyway, across the gardens, through the wrought iron gates, into the gray morning light. Edward's voice chased me to the edge of the property, haunting me even after I turned a corner. "Don't worry, you belong here now. We always find our way back." I never went back to Willowcrest Manor. I took the first bus out of Salem and didn't look behind me. But sometimes when I dust a surface in another house, I feel the weight of that manor pressing on me. The smell of old perfume returns, just faintly in the air. The whispers follow me for a moment before fading. I carry a fragment of Willowcrest wherever I go, a reminder that some obsessions are inescapable, and that sometimes the line between caretaker and captive is thinner than we think. People often become prisoners of other people's grief and obsessions without realizing it.